Hello, and thank you for joining our first Sage Intacct webinar of the year. The latest updates in the Sage Intacct 2018 releases 1 and 1.1. I'm Megan Turco, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use your webinar console. The orange arrow on the right side of your screen will let you toggle the control tray open or closed, and at the bottom of the control tray, you'll see a chat window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar via that chat function. Additionally, on your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling in through your telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option, and alternatively, if you're using your computer speakers, just select the Use Mic and Speakers option instead. And lastly, I would like to note that today's webinar is being recorded. We will send out the slides as well as a link to the on-demand recording of the webinar within about 48 hours, so definitely keep an eye out for that message if you're interested in accessing the webinar after today, or sharing with any colleagues who couldn't make it with us live. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. First up, we have Brenda Kaler, who is a senior manager on the Sage Intacct team here at Armanino. She has over 20 years of accounting experience in Big Four public accounting and in-house as controller, where she led a Sage Intacct implementation for a 50 million nonprofit operating in over 20 countries. We also have Manesh Patel, who is a manager on Armanino's Sage Intacct team. Manesh is a certified Sage Intacct implementation consultant with experience working on over 100 Sage Intacct implementations. He's also knowledgeable in various ERP systems, Concur, Basecamp, and Dropbox. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Manesh to get us started today. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks everyone for joining. It's looking forward to kind of walk through the latest updates here. Our agenda, we're going to start with global consolidations, lots of updates there, accounts payable, work our way through projects and the Salesforce integration, a few things with platform services, and then a good chunk of updates with respect to inventory and contracts. So looking forward to kind of letting you in on what's new. So we'll start with global consolidations. And if we've all been using global consolidations in the past, I would say several years, the user interface of IGC has always been separately accessible, meaning when I click on global consolidations, it opens up another browser window, and then I'm seeing this different UI, to be honest, than what Intacct actually looks like. So there's been some huge changes in the way that the actual interface looks. The best way to explain it is with the new UI, the application looks similar to the other application. So we finally have kind of a way where the aesthetic of global consolidations matches the other application. So I think that's great because, you know, in just a lot of the folks who are our clients who are using IGC, that's always been kind of something that was done on the side. So this is actually a little snapshot of the overview screen. All the applications have the overview screens, and it's going to follow the same structure. What's the data going in, meaning how many books do you have, and or what's the setup involved with the books? What's the overall task flow, meaning am I going to run consolidations? And then what are the different types of reports that I can look at after I've consolidated? We all know that once we've consolidated, then we can run financial reports off of the consolidated books. So the big news here is, you know, sometimes there's been issues with browsers, other browsers opening up IGC. It's now accessible and being moved to the Action UI. So the nice thing is it's all connected. Part of that connection as well is we get the ability to use the application and then have all of its components also match the same aesthetic. So if we are all familiar with the book setup page in the old UI with the old IGC book information, it kind of layered itself up in different tabs. This book setup here as a sample shows you very similar to how other applications look, and it matches the other, you know, the similar UI as the other applications as well. Just kind of makes it easier to manage what information goes in. As you can see, there's tabs for the entities to consolidate. What are the journals involved? What are the accounts that are going to be overridden? And what are those elimination accounts as well? So once again, just a nice UI change. And this is only available in the new UI, by the way. Also, there's been some updates with respect to handling multiple override accounts. So in the old UI, you're literally adding each account manually within each book setup. This is the ability to actually go in and change that rate table for the override accounts. And there's actually a bulk override option. So, you don't necessarily have to go through each one manually. This is a little snapshot on that left-hand side. This is the way that the actual consolidation information looks as well. So if we're also familiar with the way that the old UI's global consolidations looked for each of the entities, this one also took a little bit of a revamp. Instead of hovering over that consolidation page, you can click on the period and actually see the detailed consolidation information. So just some sleek aesthetic updates, which I think it's just going to make everything a little easier to look at. All right, we get into accounts payable as well. So there's been some updates with respect to mostly the new UI, the Intacct Action UI. For those of you that have started to use that AP Workbench, there's just been some enhancements to that AP Workbench. Once again, that AP Workbench here is a snapshot on the left-hand side. It's meant to make the overall payment processing step easier. So I'm going to be able to select bills to pay. After selecting them, I have this outbox feature is almost like a holding area, the ability to pay the bills and print the checks. So the new release actually just is involved with the My Checks area. So if I'm a AP accountant and I'm actually processing 10 bills and I'm printing those checks, and then some other AP accountant comes in and selects 10 other bills and wants to print those checks, this feature actually goes in and says, all right, well, I need to know which checks I was the payment processor on versus the other person. So as you can see in this little snapshot, that select check view shows my checks. And then if you actually click into that drop down, or you can include the filters on time period, you'll be able to see the other payers that were involved in those selections. So it's nice because in certain organizations, a lot of my clients, for example, they're going back and forth on select, which range of bills am I going to select versus you're going to select, and we need to go and select 200 a piece, for example. This is going to be nice to keep track of which of those payers are involved in which selection. So I see this live with my clients, so this is going to be a good little filter option. We'll now move to web services.
Awesome. Thanks, Manesh. So for web services, quite a few updates in this particular release. There's a new read-only object. This has been asked for quite a while, called user restriction. So this will allow you through the API to access information about how users are restricted. So you'll be able to see if they're restricted to any departments, territories, or entities right from the API. So this is great when you're under audit and also having to retrieve that information to either set up or edit existing users. Another big enhancement is the body length of Smart Event APIs has been increased to 5,000 characters. Previously, the limit was 500 characters, so this is a big enhancement and will allow you to do more sophisticated smart events if the need arises. Intacct also released version 2 of the SDK for the .NET. So this now targets the .NET Standard 1.6 to support both the .NET Framework and the .NET Core. And this was done to enhance the security and meet the compliance requirements related to the TLS encryption as well. The TLS encryption was disabled on March 16th, 2018. And what this means, you probably all saw the splash page as you were logging into Intacct. The reason you might want to be concerned about that is if you have any integrations, if you're using custom integrations or any of the marketplace integrations, if they had not upgraded to TLS 1.1 or higher, those integrations would have stopped working as of March 16th. So you are probably already aware, unless you have any integrations that have not synced since after that date. So if that is the case, I would recommend that you contact either us if we were your implementer or your provider to reach out from some assistance on those integrations to make sure by the time you need to close your March books, you have those integrations up and working again. The API was also updated in parallel with some of the UI updates that we saw. So you'll see an API update for supporting the bill in advance for contracts, which we'll get into towards the end of this webinar. There's also a behavior change when posting multiple revenue and or expense schedule entries. So previously, what the system did was it would, when it encountered an error, it would stop posting the revenue or expense schedules. So what it will do now is it will post everything in that file that does not have errors. So this will allow you to then spit out an error file that is only going to be the errors instead of printing out everything, the error as well as every correct transaction that may have been in that revenue and or expense schedule after the error was encountered. So this will allow you to be more efficient and hopefully troubleshoot those errors more quickly. In the API update, there's also the ability now to force the contract renewal dates for contracts that failed to renew at the scheduled time. So this is related to the Salesforce integration update as well as some of the contracts updates. All right, projects. So looking at the projects item, there was just a few quick updates here this time. So in the last couple of releases, Intacct has been focusing on updating and being able to actually lock down and enforce some of the capabilities of the project dimension. So on a project dimension, you have the ability to load in a start and end date. So you now have the option in the timesheet for those of you using the timesheets options and projects and time and expense. Now you can control how the timesheet is going to dictate when something falls outside of the open periods. So now there is the 3 different configuration options on how you want to handle that timesheet submission. So on the right-hand side, you can see the screenshot. If the timesheet dates fall within a closed period, you can have the system automatically post to the next open period. So this is the previous option that you had. You now also have the option to warn a user that it is going to adjust the posting period to the next open period and give them a chance to decide if they want to update their own dates or if they need to leave them as is. You also have the option to completely lock people out of making time entries to closed periods. So that will be a great option as well if you need to lock that down, especially if you're using the projects module to track any of your compliance with federal awards as a nonprofit. Making sure that those are only done during the period of availability can be a great data control kind of point right there for you. The other nice enhancement they have done with the projects module in this release is they have actually upgraded the project manager user permissions. So the project manager user can now have the ability to see what is on the proposed invoice. So they can run the preview invoice. So if you go to generate invoices and then use the preview option, they can see that actual invoice. They can see the invoice totals, and they also have the ability to see budgets and overages because they've opened up some additional reporting options there. So if you have any project management users, you will want to revisit the roles and permissions that you have allotted to those, and if any of these permissions would be helpful or necessary for your project manager users, make sure you update that so they can access these new features. And I will hand it back to Manesh.
Thank you, Brenda. All right, so the Salesforce integration is kind of broken up into a few pieces. One of the first pieces is around just ease of use. And then part of the ease of use is between finance and salespeople. So lots of good little updates here with the advanced CRM integration. So first up is that first theme that I just mentioned, opportunity, ease of use. So one of the issues that, or not really issues, but one of the areas that Intacct wanted to bridge the gap on was when sales folks are going in and filling out opportunities with pertinent sales information, at the same time, the finance team also requires information on those opportunities that are going to be important to them. By that, I mean finance is interested in defaults for maybe a fixed flat fee, or what the amount frequency is, or what the billing method is. There's information for finance that maybe sales reps may not be able to identify. So as a part of the ease of use that Intacct has added is when the sales reps actually add products to the opportunity, it's going to go in and pre-filter or pre-add in this information that finance requires. Part of that as well is just a more seamless integration between sales and finance. As well, there's been several different updates with bulk update options. When things happen to contracts, obviously contracts can change at any point in time. So when any of those contract lines change, Salesforce integration has this bulk update to update all the opportunity products at once and just give you essentially more control over making those updates. It doesn't kind of lock you in and doesn't require you to manually go into each line of the contract and make your changes. As a part of the other ease of use updates, there's been several different little themes here around the sync to Intacct. It's the button pop-up window that's been eliminated prior to this, and now they're just kind of displaying a synchronization status in the same window. I don't have screenshots for all these, but sync to Intacct was changed. Salesforce utilities, the big update here is on this right-hand side. The Intacct mass synchronization utility is now available. It's basically like a new tab on the Intacct configuration page in Salesforce. So it's going to allow you to resynchronize large numbers of records. So that's just more usable or available to grab. Manage list enhancements. So when you're initializing the subscription, now as a part of that, the integration is able to match existing records on the managed lists, and those managed lists could be stored in AR terms or billing templates or locations, any of those record level details. And lastly, there's a contact sync. So the contact field has always been an area where people have either had problems or issues with kind of matching or having a uniform list of or global list of all contacts. That contact ID field has actually increased in characters to 200 characters. So just basically more space. If it's left blank for that contact ID, the integration will go in and attempt to create a contact in the format of a last name, comma, space, first name. So if the contact already exists, it's not going to go in and make an update, but essentially Intacct as a part of the Salesforce integration is just given more space. Platform services. So kind of in line with where Brenda was talking about web services and some of those updates. I think the biggest update for platform services is around the custom document toolbar. So if we all have used either accounts receivable or order entry and print out sales invoices, order entry sales invoices, or you made your own custom AR invoices, the toolbar has always been a headache. I can tell you every implementation that I've been in, clients are confused as to why they download a toolbar and there's an error. And then we always have to email them, the step-by-step to go in and actually get that toolbar. So I'm kind of happy to say here that Intacct has released a new toolbar compatible with the stuff that Brenda just talked about, TLS 1.2, but the latest versions of Windows and Microsoft Word. So the problem with the prior toolbar was you always had to open it with an old version of Microsoft Word, which honestly didn't make much sense. So super excited here. Now you will get the new toolbar. It's very easy to go in and add some of those merge fields. And if you're familiar with customizing your own AR invoices or order entry sales invoices, it's basically a Microsoft Word document where you are inserting and removing merge fields, and those fields are all pointing to different areas of Intacct, whether it's a header of the invoice or the inside of the invoice. So definitely great information here, and for this toolbar to be updated, I think everyone, if you're using order entry or AR in some way, shape, or form, we should download this new. Or purchasing as well. Actually, that's a great point, Brenda. I do have some clients that are printing out their own custom POs and sending those to their vendors. So once again, just a good opportunity to kind of get things in alignment.
And where can one get this template, Manish?
So the custom documents, basically all custom documents that are in templates are accessible in platform services. There's going to be a list of all documents in general, and we're going to be able to see which object they're actually related to, whether they're order entry, like sales orders or sales invoices or accounts receivable invoices. It doesn't mean that when you see this huge list of documents that you're going to be using all of them. They're just meant to be templates. And then usually the best practice is download the template so you're not starting from scratch, make your changes, make it aesthetically pleasing as to what you're trying to go for, and import or upload that template back into that same area. And you can always reach out to us if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Manish.
We'll go back to Brenda here on inventory.
Okay. So this is where I think the bulk of the updates were for this release were included in the inventory and the contracts module. And by the bulk, I mean 17 new adjustments. So we actually won't have time on this webinar today to go through in depth all 17 of the adjustments. So I picked out a couple of what I thought were the major high points for it. But if you have inventory and you have not read through the release notes, you definitely want to make sure that you read through that. Here is the list of the 17 items that were updated. So if you have got stockable kits, you definitely want to make sure you read through those areas. If you've been doing any negative inventory, zero value COGS journal entries, if you have any workflow where you have value only or quantity only transaction definitions, you definitely want to make sure that you're reading through these release notes. These are some pretty significant changes that they're making to the overall costing logic. And much of these are to reduce user errors when you've got quantity and value on different transaction definitions, like in the case of a shipper and a vendor invoice. It's easy to get those misaligned because you've got to do things in a very specific order to prevent those accounting errors where you've got inventory with no value or value with no quantity. So I think a lot of these features are really aimed at the same thing, which is to understand what those costing errors have been in the past, either due to system logic or user error, and to really give you some tools to update those costings in your current year and make sure on a go-forward basis that your COGS is calculating correctly. So all of these features are really designed to include more validations to allow you to ensure that things are correct and to reduce those user errors. When you get this slide deck sent to you after this webinar, that number 17 that is highlighted, bolded, and underlined there is actually a hyperlink to where you can read about all of these individual costing improvements, since we're not going to cover them all in the webinar today. We are going to cover a few of them though. The first one that I wanted to point out and talk about is the quantity and value effects that are split across transactions. So this is what I was alluding to on the last slide there. So when you have a purchase order, there's no effect on the totals. But when your receiver comes in, you have increased your on-hand quantity. And when you get the vendor invoice, you've increased that on-hand value. Prior to this release, separate cost layers were created for the quantity-only transaction and the value-only transaction. So what happened there is then you had to synchronize and process those in the correct sequence. So for example, this will now create a single cost layer. And the value to that is it's going to link the value directly back to the quantity. So when the receiver is posted, it will create a cost layer with the quantity and a 0 value. And remember that for standard cost items, the purchase value is calculated from the cost of the item per the warehouse, just as it's always been. So there is no change when you're using a standard costing method. This also works with partial conversions. So if you have your receiver receives a quantity of 50, you can convert that as many times as you need to get that value. So it does also work with the partial conversions. So the next steps, if you have any workflows that have quantity and value transactions separated, is to review your setup and use the workflows that properly reflect your processes, as well as GAAP. For example, if your vendor invoices arrive well after you receive the goods into inventory, you might want to split the quantity and value effects across those transactions. Whereas if you almost always receive the goods and the vendor invoice together, you might want to put the quantity and value together on the vendor invoice so they are effective at the same time. So it's giving you a lot more flexibility so that you can match your actual workflow to how that's going to be reflected in terms of quantity and value in your system. You also now have the ability to link inventory adjustments to specific purchases. So previously, when you created a value-only inventory adjustment transaction for FIFO and LIFO items, the change in value couldn't be tied back to an existing FIFO or LIFO cost layer. So a new layer was created with the quantity of 0, leaving the valuation of both the items and the COGS understated. So now, when you select a purchasing or inventory control transaction to link the value-only adjustment to, the existing cost layer for the link transaction is going to be adjusted for the change in value. So this maintains the integrity of the underlying accounting treatment, provides a great audit trail, and it also more accurately reflects what you actually intend when you have an adjustment. So in keeping with kind of the effects, so with the last release, there are difference in cost methods available on the inventory module. So this slide here is giving you the inventory effect when you have a quantity and value transaction, a value-only transaction, or a quantity-only transaction for all of the 4 costing methods that are available in Intacct. So if you are using any of these, this is a good kind of check box to see what you want to do next. One exception that I want to call out for you is for those standard costing items. For standard costing items, the value-only adjustments, whether you link or not, a journal entry is going to be created. So there is not going to be an effect in the subledger for standard costing items, regardless of whether or not you actually attempt to link it to a transaction. So that's the big call out for you there. So one of the things I think most people are probably thinking at this point, if you have the inventory module, is that these are a lot of changes, and how is the best practice to actually implement a lot of these changes? So a few releases ago, Intacct introduced the concept of recalculate inventory costs. And they realized that part of the naming of that button scared people away because you didn't want to recalculate things going back. So they have renamed that button to maintain inventory valuation. So what that button is going to do is going to allow you to update for all of these new costing methods. So part of the reason why they changed the name of it is they want to reinforce that keeping your inventory costs updated or maintained based on transactions being processed in the transaction date order should be part of your organization's normal processing. So to enable that, they've renamed it so it's a little less scary than recalculate versus to maintain the valuation and maintain that logic that you have added into the system. So we have a couple different options here. So now they have moved the analyze and update. Previously, it was a button kind of in the top with the run now, cancel, more actions buttons. So now it is a radial button. So when you do the analyze costs, it doesn't post anything. So that's just for you to get a report and take a look at it. So if you have not rerun your maintain inventory valuation since mid-January, we recommend that you go ahead and do so now. You probably want to take a look to analyze your costs first to see what kind of adjustments might be needed, and then do the update costs after you have determined which adjustments are the correct ones there. So another nice field that they have added is an as of date. So when you switch from analyze to update, you get a couple boxes that appear. You get your as of date, and you also get your options as to where you want to update it. So prior to adding the date field, when you selected the recalculate button, the recalculation went back to the very first transaction that was loaded into Intacct. The date that you should set in here is going to be the very first time you started using the inventory module. If you had the inventory module up and running as of the first day of your go live, that would be your date. However, if you implemented the inventory module at a later point in time, your as of date should be the first date that you started running transactions through your sub module. If you set it to a date earlier than that, Intacct will override it. The other options are expanded options for how you want to update the cost. Well, you'll typically want to update all costs, including the internal cost tracking tables, the inventory control subledger, as well as the general ledger. You can now skip posting to the general ledger if you would like. Not posting allows you to clean up your subledger reports without changing the general ledger. However, you need to remember that if you do choose this option, that it will leave your inventory valuation and general ledger out of balance, and it will require you to post some journal entries to adjust those to make them in parity. You can also choose to update the costs in the internal cost tracking tables and inventory control subledger starting in closed periods. The COGS in the general ledger cannot be updated in closed periods, so you have that option as well. In terms of next steps, what you want to do is you want to run your inventory valuation maintenance to update your inventory costs without updating cost of goods sold in the general ledger to bring your environment up to a clean starting point. So that's going to take care of kind of the historicals and allow you to start with the new costing logic going forward. You'll use the as of date from when you first started using the inventory control submodule. And all your subsequent cost of goods sold postings in the next open period will be correct. And the on-hand quantities are accurate, especially if you have been using negative quantities in the past. Negative quantities are often used previously in the integrations when you had quantity adjustments. So if you need any help or you'd like any additional guidance on how to approach this costing update, please reach out to us. We would be happy to assist. All right, I'll hand it back to Manesh to close us out with contracts.
Yep. Thank you, Brenda. So kind of a few key points with contracts, just mostly ease of use, but also just kind of operational updates. We'll start with kind of the first one, which businesses are obviously concerned with the way that cash is coming in as a foundation, and billing schedules help to kind of manage that. Earlier we get the cash, we can use that cash to kind of manage our customer and or use that cash for just running the business. So Intacct has released a bill in advance feature on the contract. So you see that little box on the bottom left-hand side? That's basically the new feature where you're going to be able to go in and select a length and period. And this is just kind of the default number of days or months before each contract line starts and ends. And that's going to allow us to essentially bill a contract in advance. And you can then add that contract line to that contract. So once again, just a nice feature to help manage cash flow. And this little snapshot here shows you a contract line's billing schedule. That billing schedule has a start date, which is automatically set to the contract line start date, minus the bill in advance period that we put in. And you'll see in the sample below, to the right-hand side, that the start date is scheduled to 1 month before the contract line start date. So once again, just nice operational feature to kind of better run operations in terms of cash flow. Intacct is also, for anyone who is involved with MEA, multiple element arrangement type of situations or contracts, Intacct is focused on making that MEA accounting a little bit easier. And so what has been added is the ability to determine a fair value price for an item based upon the percentage of other items. And it's just improved calculations on fair value prices. This example over here shows you a company that sells some software and some maintenance as a part of an overall package. We're going to estimate that the price of the maintenance is a certain percentage. In this case, we just chose 10% of the software's fair value price. And then through that, we're going to be able to determine that information that's boxed. What's the billing method? Is it quantity based? What's the default to the numbers of included units from the billing price list? What's that quantity? And optionally, all these other fields that shows you what the multiplier is on fair value. So once again, just some more refinements to the way that MEA is handled. This bottom section over here kind of just shows you a little snapshot of some of the new fields that that MEA has included, mostly around bundles and a preview table. So it's just helping you better understand the way that revenue is allocated. So those are the two box components. Once again, just more for transparency or just better running of the business. In conclusion, I'm going to actually let Brenda do the in conclusion since I did the agenda, but she's going to walk through and close us out.
Awesome. So thank you for joining us today. We covered global consolidations, updates to accounts payable, projects, our Salesforce integration, some platform services updates, as well as inventory and contracts. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out.
And we did get actually a few questions through the Q&A. So since we've got a few minutes left, we've got some time.
Awesome.
I'll ask you guys the questions. And of course, for our audience here, if you guys do have any additional questions, like Brenda mentioned, you're welcome to reach out, but you're also welcome to add those to the chat function on your GoToWebinar console. And we'll get to as many of them as we can this morning. So Brenda, I think this one's actually for you. How often should we be running inventory revaluation?
Oh, that's a good point. I forgot to mention that. So inventory revaluation, Intacct is recommending that be set to schedule and run on a daily basis so that you're constantly capturing all those new transactions and adjustments that have been made and that it's keeping your cost layers constantly up to date.
Thanks, Brenda. And Manesh, this one's actually for you. It's a two-part question. Will the My Checks feature work with the old UI, and how does it work if two people are processing payment requests?
Yeah, that's a good question, Megan. So in the recent use case that I've seen, where a client is one particular accountant is selecting a range of bills to select from, and another accountant is selecting another. Basically, it's only available in the new Action UI, and two, it is a drop down. So the My Checks will show up for the person who selected, the payer who selected those particular bills to print, and there will be a drop down. Let's just say that second accountant is out of the office for whatever reason. There will be a drop down for the person who's who actually is out of office to select that person's checks and print them for them. So just nice, but yes, it only works in the new UI.
Thanks, Manish. And actually, I think this one's also for you. Does the new bill in advance feature send invoices monthly automatically?
That's a good question. It does have the ability to generate the invoices. In terms of sending the invoices, like, are we referring, Liz, to like emailing those invoices to people, like to our customers? We probably have to follow up and test that.
So if we need to follow up and test, we can definitely, obviously we'll
run a quick test,
we'll connect with you guys
and see if it actually does have more automated capability besides for just generating the invoice.
And then Brenda, we've got one more for you. Now that you can edit consolidation books, what is the best practice if you know that you have changes that are needed?
That's a great question. So I know when I was a client that sometimes I would add a new account and forget to set the override before the consolidation was done. So I would have loved to have had this option to be able to edit consolidation books previously. So my recommendation would be, if you are planning to edit a consolidation book, is that you only want to go back and reconsolidate back to your last open period, or your last unaudited period. So if you are a public company and you have quarterly filings, you might not want to go back into the last quarters. But if you're a private company or a nonprofit, I would go back to the beginning of your fiscal year and reconsolidate the entire year with any changes that you may have made to your consolidation, so that way you can ensure that it has the same treatment throughout the year, and that all of your edits are captured and flow through correctly.
Thanks, Brendan. Actually, one more did come in, so I lied on that last one. That wasn't the last one. Is the user restriction read-only available to all users or just admin?
I'll take that one. That's a web services question. So I would say that is available for anybody that is using web services. So you don't need a special license for that necessarily, but you do need to have admin credentials when accessing the API because that is actually an admin function.
All right. Well, thank you both, Brenda and Manish. That does wrap up our Q&A session for today. If anyone does have additional specific questions, you are welcome to reach out to either Brenda or Manish or anyone on the Armanino team. And as you exit, definitely remember there's a quick survey, so definitely take a moment to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar. And thank you for your time.